Hello everyone, and welcome to my channel. This channel is for education, and we usually check out great theories of everything, all-encompassing theories, grand unified theories, magnum opuses, tour de forces, and earth-shattering discoveries, mostly from obscure sources, but I believe today is number 210 of our Bible Decode series, which is part of our Reciprocal Church unit, where we are trying to put together an array of things that you can use to get closer to the divine, to feel a sense of reverence about your life. And I foresee that one day we're going to have 8, 9, 10 billion people with 8, 9, or 10 billion different religions, because all of the, especially in the West, all of the Western religions are about to go crash and burn due to fraud and lack of evidence. That includes Christianity, which we're talking about here with the New Testament, also Judaism, Islam, Satanism, and atheism, also known as scientism, and to a limited extent, communism. And all of these things are things that you're going to need to bail out from here very soon. Your parachute is the Reciprocal Church. What you're going to need to pull yourself together and be able to feel like you can be communing with God, or whatever you want to call it, the Creator, without having all of this nonsense pushed on you from all of these books, the Bible, New Testament or Old, the Quran, or, books like the Red Book or the Communist Manifesto, or any of the other books that are used by Origin of Species or whatever. All of these books actually are probably not nearly as bad as their dogma has led it over the years since the book was written. But in the case of the New Testament, that is not true. The New Testament, according to a lot of the sources that we've been going over, is an obvious psychological operation by the Romans. The Caesars of the Flavian dynasty from 69 to 96 AD, including Emperor Vespasian and his two sons, Emperors Titus and Domitian, they wrote the New Testament. They, or their agents, their court historians or their family members or both, wrote the New Testament as a psychological operation against the Jews. The Romans had just gotten done fighting the Jews in this Jewish war, or War of the Jews, from 66 to 73 AD. Titus and Vespasian at that time were generals, and they were both wounded in the war. And just like really all of the other Roman royals, they were sick and tired of dealing with the Jews, always rising up, always creating riots and terrorist attacks and revolutions and insurrections and even wars, culminating in this Jewish war, which was started by three self-proclaimed Jewish messiahs who believed that they were there to help the Jews overthrow the Romans, which turned out to be rather unrealistic. But when you think you have God on your side, then you think anything is realistic, I guess. All of them were ultimately executed. But and the Romans completely destroyed the Jewish population and the city of Jerusalem. But they recognized that the resilience of the Jews and how they were going to come back at some point. It took a while to get to the Bar Kokhba revolt in 132 AD, but perhaps what held them at bay for so long was this New Testament, which was written for them, depicting a Jewish Messiah who, instead of being the military commander, was a Prince of Peace and believed in rendering unto Caesar what is Caesar's and walking an extra mile with the Roman soldier's pack and turning the other cheek to oppression, while at the same time doing damage to the Jewish traditions in the temple, overturning the tables of the money changers, changing the non-kosher money to the kosher money, and messing with the Jewish entrepreneurs out there selling small animals for the sacrifice. Jesus in every way in the Gospels is deferential to Rome and rather negative toward the Jews. And then if you keep going in the Bible, the New Testament, Paul is even more so, even more pro-Roman. And, this theory has a lot of proof, a lot of evidence, circumstantial and direct evidence that supports it that I've gone through ad nauseum in previous videos. So if you want to get the whole skinny on that, you can go back and watch really any of my previous 209 videos here. But what we're looking at here today is a book by Rosemary Sheldon and Thais Voskuilen called Operation Messiah, which is an offshoot kind of the Roman origins hypothesis, which has been forwarded by probably about a dozen authors by this point. And these guys here in Operation Messiah are knocking at the door of independently coming up with this idea that the Romans created the New Testament. But they stop short really just saying that actually Saul or Paul was a Roman agent, a spy for the Romans. And he orchestrated a lot of events that, made them pro-Roman, but also was surveilling the Christian and the Jesus's followers and the Nazarenes as the time went on. This, I think, is short-sighted, and they probably did not know about Joseph Atwill's book Caesar's Messiah, which had just come out when they wrote this in, I think, 2007 or so. Not sure about the exact date there. Atwill's book is from 2005, and it wasn't like it did well, but it wasn't like a household name or anything. Yeah, if they would have been able to kind of grasp that it's more encompassing than just Paul being a Roman agent. It was that the entire thing was like a Roman agent. But anyway, we will point out, places where they could have used the Roman origins hypothesis to help them out, and other places where maybe they are making a more cogent argument than, say, Joseph Atwill or Michael Menescot's in his book Christianity's Origin as a Flavian Secrecy Cult. Now, I think we're in chapter 3 of this book, and we're about to start a section that's called Social Class. The scholars who are persuaded that Saul was a Roman citizen presume that he came from a privileged or upper-class background. Many believe that Saul's father, as a Roman citizen, was a well-to-do and honored man in Tarsus. If Saul's upbringing was middle or upper class, he would not have been working with his hands. Many believe his education exempted him from manual work. How do we recognize this, reconcile this picture with Saul the tent maker? Those who accept the assertion in Acts that Saul studied under Gamaliel assume that he learned his trade as part of his Pharisaic training. A Jew who intended to devote himself to the service of the law learned a trade for the sake of his independence. It has been suggested that Saul was a manual laborer trained by his father, also a manual laborer, and that from the beginning he worked with his hands to support himself. It has also been suggested that Saul was disinherited from his native Jerusalem and deprived of institutional support. He then learned a trade in order to survive. Still others have suggested that Saul got his training as a tent maker in Antioch, and he may also have furthered his Hellenistic education there. An alternative Christian explanation is that Saul's tent making was voluntary work of self-denial. It is a stretch indeed to think that Saul was upper class, but voluntarily subordinated himself for Christian piety. The most controversial interpretation is perhaps that which suggests Saul not only had Herodian connections, that is, as in the family of Herodian connections, but that he was related to the Jewish royal family. Is that the Maccabees, or is this... we'll keep going. Saul refers in Romans 16:7 to his cousin, the littlest Herod. Oh, they're talking about the Herods, who I believe also did have certainly some Maccabean blood too, or Hasmonean. In the same breath as sending his regards to all those in the household of Aristobulus. This has been interpreted to mean Aristobulus, king of Lesser Armenia, the son of Herod of Chalcis, whose wife Salome danced at Herod's birthday party for the head of John the Baptist. If this is correct, then Saul's influence in Jerusalem, while still a comparatively young man, would not be surprising. It would explain his connection with the chief priests over whom Herod of Chalcis had control. Acts' reticence with respect to the identity of Saul's nephew and sister is suspicious. All of this evidence would support Saul's connection to the Herods, who were pro-Roman client kings, therefore making Saul's Roman connections that much closer. This is simply another problem for which we have no solution. The philosophical and religious influences which people keep trying to trace to Saul's childhood may have in fact begun later in life. During his visits to Tarsus and elsewhere, his ability to write and speak in Greek may also have been acquired later. Saul's early life is simply not recoverable. This section is called Who Was Saul? What can we say for certain about this mysterious man named Saul? The picture we are given in our New Testament sources on Saul of Tarsus before his conversion, so-called, is both contradictory and suspect. Information given by any person about himself always has to be treated with a certain reserve, since everyone has strong motives for putting him or herself in the best possible light. The information given about Saul in Acts also requires close scrutiny, as this work was written by someone with a laudatory view of Saul. Saul himself, in his letters, never mentions that he came from Tarsus, even when he is at his most autobiographical. The impression he wished to give of coming from impeccable Pharisaic background would have been much impaired by the admission that he in fact came from Tarsus, where there were few, if any, Pharisee teachers, and a Pharisee training would have been hard to acquire. It is not an unreasonable assumption, therefore, to accept Tarsus as Saul's birthplace. Saul wanted his audience to believe he came from a Pharisaic background, so as to increase his stature in their eyes. The fact that this question is hardly ever asked shows how strong the influence of traditional religious attitudes is in Pauline studies. Christian scholars hold Saul in deep reverence and never say anything to suggest that he may have been less than truthful at times. The evidence is strong enough, however, to imply that the level of deception used by Saul could be quite high when he felt circumstances warranted it. Chapter 26 of Acts cannot be regarded as the authentic words addressed by Saul to King Agrippa. Rather, they are a rhetorical speech composed by the author in the style of ancient historians. Thus, the claim made in the speech that Saul's career as a Pharisee of high standing was, quote, known to all Jews, cannot be taken at face value. At best, we can say that he writes like, sounds like, and thinks somewhat like a diaspora Jew. Or perhaps he's complete fiction. Was Saul a Roman citizen as he claims? If Saul were indeed a Roman citizen, and if he inherited that citizenship from his father, then the following scenario is possible. Saul's father was a tent maker or leather worker who worked for enough big clients to make him a rich man. If that client was the Roman army, making military tents, for example, then Saul's father may have curried enough favor with the Roman government to be given a grant of citizenship for service to the empire, or become rich enough to buy Roman citizenship. Saul would have learned his trade from his father and inherited the Roman citizenship from him. I'm just wondering, it doesn't quite make sense that that's how it would work. That if Saul was already born and then his father becomes a Roman citizen, I don't believe that would make Saul automatically a Roman citizen. Now, if he hadn't been born until he was the Roman citizen, then that would make more sense to me. If either father or son were religious Jews, however, this scenario would probably not have been possible. A Jew who had spent most of his life in Jerusalem would be much more prone to describe himself as a citizen of Jerusalem. It has been suggested that Saul moved to Jerusalem when he was already a grown man, and he left his parents behind in Tarsus. This seems all the more probable in that Saul's parents receive no mention in any account of Saul's experiences in Jerusalem. Saul, having worked with his father and the Romans in Tarsus, sets out as a young man to go to Jerusalem and to work his way into the power structure there. This would mean allying himself with the temple administrators, who in turn were clients of the Romans. Is it so hard to believe that Saul may have been sent by the Romans to Jerusalem with a specific mission? The city was a hotbed of anti-Roman activity. The Romans needed all the infiltration agents they could get to keep an eye on the Jews, especially those with nationalistic tendencies. The Jesus Party was still active in Jerusalem, and its members knew too many people in the capital. The Romans could not use a local agent. What better way to infiltrate the nascent Jesus movement than to take an aspiring young Jewish provincial from a trusted family that had already done favors for the Romans and sponsor his trip to Jerusalem, the big city, to feed his ambition and use him for gathering intelligence? Travel was expensive in the ancient world. Where would a tent maker's son get the money for such a long voyage, not to mention supporting himself in Jerusalem once he got there? We are suggesting that Saul was a diaspora Jew who worked for the Romans. He moved to Jerusalem and allied himself with the Sadducees and worked with Roman collaborators. He persecuted members of the Jesus movement in order to curry favor with the Jews. When this did not bring him the power and fame he craved, he decided to go undercover, reject the Jews, and fake a conversion. He understood the potential of the growing Jesus movement and quickly assembled a set of credentials to support the leadership role he wanted. His mystical call, his name change, and a superb educational background. He spread a message that Jesus spoke to him and wanted Christians to collaborate with the Romans. One thing seems sure in the mystery of Saul's life. He was a member of a client group beholden to the Roman administration. This predicament yielded a very complex and difficult kind of double-mindedness, a combination of pride and shame in one's past, depending on the context. It meant collaborating with people whom many Jews considered the enemy. It meant dealing with groups who had a nationalistic agenda, while also dealing with people dedicated to seeing that nationalism never reached fruition. Saul's double life and thus double-mindedness is also characteristic of someone working undercover for an intelligence organization. Just how Saul went undercover is the subject of chapter 5, as our agent takes a fateful trip to Damascus. Okay, now that is the end. I thought that was chapter 3, but perhaps it was chapter 4. See if we're going to Damascus. I'm just kind of scrolling through the footnotes here. And no, this is chapter 4, called Saul the Persecutor. Saul, prior to his conversion, was involved in persecuting the followers of Jesus. This activity is mentioned in Acts 8:1, 9:1, 22:4, and also 26:9, as well as in Paul's own letters, 1 Corinthians 15:9, Galatians 1:13, and Philippians 3:6. But as usual, there are serious incompatibilities in these accounts. The degree to which Saul persecuted the followers of the Way, the identity of these people, their locale, the purpose and extent of Saul's persecutions, and his jurisdiction are still subjects of debate. The major problem is that the material in Acts and in the letters does not always agree. We thus know distressingly little about Saul's persecution of Jesus' followers. For whom did Saul work while performing these acts? In whose name did he persecute? Who were his victims? It is clear that Acts uses Saul's persecuting as a foil against which to display his later missionary activity to advantage. So this bias offers little help. Given the gaps in our knowledge, it is no wonder that scholars have come to no consensus on the nature of or the motivation for Saul's life as a persecutor. The picture given in New Testament sources of Saul in the days before his conversion are contradictory and suspect. This section is called the Stoning of St. Stephen, or Stoning of Stephen. Saul's first appearance in the sources is as a young man in Jerusalem around 36 CE. A controversy broke out in a Jerusalem synagogue. Saul is depicted as an approving official who watched the stoning of St. Stephen and at whose feet the crowd placed Stephen's garments. Although he is compliant in this grisly deed through his passivity, he would later act more actively and brutally in such repression. We are told that he broke into houses to drag men and women off to prison without due process in Acts 8:3. In Acts 9:1, Saul appears as a bitter enemy of the Jesus followers, breathing threatenings and slaughter against the disciples of the Lord. They are jailed, Acts 4:3. They are beaten, Acts 5:40. And they are threatened in Acts 4:18. The turning point in Acts 7 comes when Stephen is tried by a religious court for preaching against Moses and then is stoned to death. In Acts, Jewry in general is involved in this event. The author shows this by having Jews from throughout the diaspora first accuse Stephen, then by having the people with their leaders carry out the arrest. Here Luke also used an abundance of third-person plural pronouns, so that we read in the English translation that they stirred up the people, and they came upon him and seized him and brought him before the council, and they set up false witnesses. Acts 6, 12 and 13. A general persecution follows, and all Nazarenes except the apostles flee Jerusalem. Putting Saul at the execution of Stephen creates the impression that his adherence to Pharisaism caused him to show violent hostility toward the followers of Jesus. Although we are told by Acts that Saul was harrying the church in Acts 8:3, we are not told by what authority or on whose orders he was carrying out this persecution. First, the word church is a misnomer because this group of Jewish believers did not separate itself from the Jewish temple as a different religious entity. Secondly, this harrying was clearly not a matter of merely individual action on Saul's part, for sending people to prison could only be done by some kind of official. Saul must have been acting on behalf of some authority, and who this authority was can be gleaned from later incidents in which Saul is shown acting on behalf of Caiaphas, the high priest. Anyone, however, with knowledge of the religious and political scene at this time in Judea can detect a serious problem with this interpretation. The high priest was not a Pharisee, but a Sadducee, and the Sadducees were bitterly opposed to the Pharisees. How is it that Saul, allegedly an enthusiastic Pharisee of Pharisees, is acting hand in glove with the Sadducean high priest? there is also the possibility that Saul was working for the Romans. If these dissidents were wanted for political reasons, then the Romans might not have left their investigation entirely in the hands of the high priest. So the questions are, was there a persecution of Jesus' followers who was carrying it out? Who was carrying it out, and who were its victims? Stephen's martyrdom is the great turning point in Acts. It inaugurates a period of Jewish persecution of Christianity. Acts clearly links the persecution with Stephen's death. In fact, it starts on the same day. In reality, the persecution had started much earlier, namely when Jesus was still active. See, that's the connection that they need to make. They're like, well, if it started much earlier when Jesus was still active, maybe Jesus is also a Roman agent. Maybe not in the flesh Roman agent, but serving as a Roman agent because he's fiction. And so he is written as part of a Roman psychological operation. That is the clue that they needed to jump on to be able to have a more expansive view of this. According to the Gospels, the authorities worked with informers like Judas and then came after the leader of the movement, recruiting an informer, sending him out on a mission, evaluating his information, and sending out a group of officers to arrest the target is what we describe as good intelligence work. Others might describe it as persecution. It is only after Stephen's martyrdom in Acts that the term the Jews is used so frequently in a pejorative sense. In Acts, or because it's used in a pejorative sense throughout the Gospels, maybe not throughout, but in several places in the Gospels. Yet this turning point is never attested to outside Acts. Neither are Stephen and his martyrdom. The narrative in Acts is very little help in reconstructing the nature of the dispute between Stephen and other members of his synagogue, if indeed this incident is historical. One scholar has argued that the incident was probably confined to the synagogue of the freedmen and did not involve the high priest at all. Acts, however, implies that the persecution was initiated at the highest levels of the Jewish establishment by Caiaphas and the members of his council. Why was the high priest doing this, and what did he have against the Nazarenes?